To begin, let's talk about some slavery context in New York around the time that Sojourner Truth was a slave. At this point, there had been a few acts that helped slaves become more free, and in 1799, they posted an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. It provided for gradual manumission, which allowed masters to keep their younger slaves in bondage for most of their productive years to recoup their investment. The law freed all children born to slave women after July 4th, 1799, but not all at once. The males became free at 28 and the females at 25. Till then, they would be property of their mother's master. Slaves already in servitude before July 4th, 1799, remained slaves for life, though they were reclassified as indentured servants. Sojourner Truth, who was originally called Isabella, was born between the years 1797 and 800 to James and Betsy, slaves of Colonel Ardenburgh Hurley, Ulster County, New York. Isabella had many siblings, however, many of them got sold upon dictating this story, so she could not remember them all. Isabella's mother believed in God and would tell her stories about him as she was growing up, and that is where she was introduced to Christianity. Her master Charles was a kind master and treated his slaves well. In fact, her parents were so appreciated by their slave master that he granted them a small plot of land where they were able to grow things that they could sell or eat. She grew up in a Dutch colony, so she and her family spoke Low Dutch. Fever sores were a big threat for slaves in that time, and they unfortunately were the killers of both her father and her mother. During the time of her father's death, it talks about how hard it was for her, and the book says this: in those hours of her extremity, she did not forget the instructions of her mother to go to God in all her trials, and in every affliction. And she not only remembered, but obeyed, going to him and telling him all, and asking him if he thought it was right, and begged him to protect and shield her from her persecutors. She always asked in an unwavering faith that she should receive just what she pleaded for. There's a line in the book that says she never remembers asking for anything, but she got it. And she received it as an answer to her prayers. And when she got beaten, she never knew long enough to go beforehand to pray, and always thought if only she had time to pray for God for help, she could escape the beating. She had no idea God had any knowledge of her thoughts, save what she told him or heard her prayers unless they were spoken audibly. And consequently, she could not pray unless she had time or opportunity to go by herself, where she could talk to God without being overheard. When she was still young, she got separated from her parents at an auction and went to work for John Neely, who was a cruel master and whipped her often. She prayed often that she would get rebought by a different slave owner, and was bought by another slave owner named Scriver, who was a fisherman. He treated her better and would give her jobs like browse a store, collect roots and herbs for beer, hoe corn, and carry in fish. A year later, she was sold to John J. Dumont, where she remained almost until her emancipation. When she moved to John Jay's farm, his wife was very cruel, along with her white servant, and they would constantly point out her flaws and roast her if she did anything less than perfect. Her white servant Kate went as far as ruining the food that Isabella would cook so that she could look bad to her master. But Isabella was so determined to please her master that she worked extremely hard, and sometimes wouldn't sleep so that she would get as much work done as possible. Because she would do this, the other slaves would take notice, and they would even taunt her, basically calling her a suck-up. She became so engulfed in this behavior that she ended up seeing slavery as right. At this point, the story shifts a little bit. She spends a long time trying to find her son, and even pays money to get him back. She ends up finding out that his previous slave owner sold him out of state, which was against the law at the time, so she ends up going to trial with this man and goes down in history for being one of the first slaves to win a trial against a white man. In the last chapter of this section, Isabella's religious experience, it goes more in depth about her relationship with Christ. A quote from the book says, "He says that God revealed himself to her with all the suddenness of a flash of lightning, showing her, in the twinkling of an eye, that he was all over, that he pervaded the universe, and that there was no place where God was not. She became instantly conscious of her great sin in forgetting her almighty friend, and ever-present help in time of trouble. Then she exclaims, 'Oh God, I did not know you were so big.' Before she had this realization, she thought that God was a kind of being like her, but more powerful, so she talked to him like that. She thought God was almost in submission to her because she would ask him for things, but later realized that she was being almost blasphemous. One last thought about this that I thought was interesting was at first she thought that she was the only one that knew Jesus, and so she didn't want to tell others about him because she was scared that he wouldn't have as much time for her anymore. But slowly she began to realize that other people know Jesus, and she was surprised by this. She is famous for becoming a huge civil rights activist for women and slaves, and that is why she is famous to this day.
After reviewing what slavery looked like through the life of Sojourner Truth, we can now look closer at some of the expectations that society had placed on both female and male slaves, as well as the overall white man and woman. Within slave communities, African women typically cooked meals, married enslaved men, and raised their children. Marriages between two slaves were known as mock marriages, as they were unrecognized by civil law and could easily be deemed invalid at any time. Regarding treatment that African women endured, they were treated the same as male slaves. Many white slave owners did not believe that Africans were children of Adam and Eve, like themselves, therefore they did not have to be treated as equally as themselves. Regardless of gender, African slaves endured the same brutal beatings and inhumane living conditions. In Haiti, women had a bit more leverage than slaves in America, giving them the potential to negotiate better living conditions, although their odds were not always in their favor. Many female slaves endured sexual violence on top of the unbiased beatings and whippings. White oppressors would rape the female slaves to expand their property, resulting in more slaves. After slavery, black women still endured unfair treatment. As noted in Sojourner Truth's popular speech, Ain't I a Woman?, she expresses her desire for black women to have the same rights as white women. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, she said. African men were expected to be stronger than females. Despite being forced to do hard labor and work inhumane amounts of times in poor conditions, men were set to higher standards than females, given that they were not expected to bear and raise children on top of work. As mentioned, African men often married women, but were frequently separated from their wives and children due to being sold to new slave owners. After slavery, African men continued to endure racism, frequently portrayed negatively by the white man. In novels such as those written by Thomas Dixon, the KKK was praised and black men were portrayed as violent rapists to continue shedding negative light on black men. White men were believed to be superior to women in society. White men were expected to be resilient, intelligent, emotionless, and strong. As mentioned in the narrative of Sojourner Truth, white men such as Charles Ardenburg inherited land and slaves from their fathers. White men also raped their female slaves to increase property and to produce more. These men then went on to profit off of the new slaves by either selling them or putting them to work on their property. White women experienced gendered treatment given that they were viewed as inferior to men. They were treated gently by white men and were usually under the protective custody of their father or husband. Despite being inferior to men in society, white women also owned slaves. Slaves were typically inherited by women through fathers or given to them as gifts. It was not uncommon for them to own slaves. As a matter of fact, 40% of American slave owners were women. Having slaves made them good prospects for marriage, and once married, many women fought to keep their slaves as their own instead of them becoming their husbands. In many cases, they won. Many white women had slaves to care for their children instead of doing it themselves. They also experienced humiliation and brainwashing from when their husbands went off to rape their slaves.
We looked at gender roles and made a comparison between men and women and ethnicity. Society not only established gender roles, but also demanded that their slaves act and behave in a certain way. We are going to analyze how these expectations impacted slaves and specifically Sojourner Truth. Psychological slavery was a term coined by Robert Williams in 1973 to describe the drastic impact that being enslaved had on one's personality, self-esteem, and self-image. The personality, self-esteem, and self-image stereotyped by slaveholders was so concrete and widespread that slaves internalized those stereotypes and were persuaded to live into them in hopes of a tangible or abstract reward. We now see that slaves were conditioned through punishment and reward. When a slave partook in an action that had a beneficial behavior towards their master, they were rewarded, or at the very least, not punished, which, in a sense, was a reward. If a slave's actions or behaviors didn't follow the stereotype or the desired outcome the master had in mind, a punishment was inevitable. In the narrative of Sojourner Truth, the commencement of Isabella's trials in life, we would find she could only talk Dutch, and this had been a source of suffering. In the book, it says she could only talk Dutch, and the Neelys could only talk English. Mr. Neely could understand Dutch, but Isabella and her mistress could neither of them understand the language of the other, and this of itself was a formidable obstacle in the way of a good understanding between them, and for some time was a fruitful source of dissatisfaction to the mistress and punishment and suffering to Isabella. Isabella, or Sojourner Truth, was whipped and beaten and conditioned through punishment in hopes that she would learn in the future how her master wanted her to behave. Through punishment, we see Sojourner Truth being conditioned to behave in a desired way, and through conditioning, punishment and reward, we also see her change her personality in order to meet the needs and the expectations of her masters, and she also has to morph her self-esteem and self-image in order to survive in this environment. Not being considered human but only property had a drastic impact on someone's personality. Having to change or take on this new perspective or personality usually led to the relinquishing of definite morals and principles, ditching the values that person used to hold dear. We can see here that Isabella was conditioned and rewarded for all the good work she did, and she started craving that. And so she kind of let her innate human nature essentially go and only worked for her master in order to please him. On the same page as the quote we just looked at, she also says she firmly believed that slavery was right and honorable. Now, to me, this sounds similar to Stockholm Syndrome. The hostage, or the slave, starts to have positive feelings towards the capturer or master. Then the capturer, in this case, does something that seemingly reciprocates the hostages, or the slaves, feelings, which finally lead to a negative viewpoint of those who are trying to free the hostages or slaves. The negative viewpoint to those who are trying to free the hostages or the slaves is very apparent in the narrative, because when we talk about Isabella's son, he was taken at a young age, and so when his mother fights for him and for him to be able to go back, he's scared because all he's ever known is his master, who is an authority figure, who is his so-called protector, and because of small little gestures, her son is not claiming to be Isabella's son, but instead staying with his master. I think Sojourner Truth was lucky enough to not get swept away by society and its thinking because of the witnessing of her parents being emancipated, as well as being introduced and knowing God as the God who is the authority figure of all, and also having peers that started speaking out and against slavery. Other than that, I think she could have seriously been stuck in some of the societal norms.